So you need a translation done. Maybe you're a small business, you are a company owner, you're an individual, anything along those lines, and you need a translation done from one language into another, and you have no idea where to start or how to go about it. Should you use Google Translate? Should you use a translation agency? Should you use a translator? Should you use an LSP? Maybe you came across that term at some point. And where do you start? What do you use? What's best? How do you go about it? These are all valid questions. Obviously, if you're not in the industry, you might not know these. So let's briefly go over how you can go about getting a translation done in the best way. So broadly speaking, there are three, this is very generally speaking, I should say, this whole video will be, but there are three methods that you can use. One is machine translation, think Google Translate. The second is to hire a translator directly. And the third is to hire a translation agency. Let's go through each of these a bit more in detail so you see what the pros and cons are for each. The first one that we can start off with is machine translation, i.e. Google Translate. All of you have probably heard of Google Translate, maybe Bing Translate or one of the other options. And this is often very attractive because it's free, it's quick, it's instant, it's there, it's accessible to everyone. And this is a great option if you're reading some article in German and you want to know what it's saying in English, or you kind of want to know what this word or expression is in another language. And it's something that you can look up easily, and more or less it should be able to work. Now, having said that, you may have heard there are also issues with things like Google Translate, and people who are in the industry, in the translation industry, they know this by heart, but there are quite a few issues that still come up. Unfortunately, most of the public, when they hear about machine translation, they hear about the great strides and the things that have been accomplished in terms of machine translation, in terms of AI with translation and stuff like that. And so they figure, well, at this point, machine translation can work perfectly. Except that's not really the case. In fact, very often it's not the case. Recently, Amazon launched Amazon Sweden and decided to use AI translation for all the products that were being sold there. And so this created quite a meme because a lot of the products got translated as something sexual, which they were not intended to be. And so it created a lot of hoopla. You may have heard of some other examples of things like this happening and some mistakes with AI translation, or chances are you've seen the memes of badly translated menus, storefront signs, road signs, etc., etc. All of these are due to machine translation. These are mistakes in machine translation, and these are mistakes that pop up when people use machine translation. Unfortunately, machine translation is still not optimal. There are a lot of mistakes that can be made, and I won't go into all the detail, but just so you know more or less what's going on here, very often machine translation, first of all, it uses English as an intermediary. So if you're translating, say, from Italian into Chinese, it will go Italian into English and English into Chinese. And this matters because English doesn't have a lot of things that other languages often have. It doesn't have formal and informal. It doesn't have masculine, feminine, or anything along those lines. So if you are translating from, say, Italian into Korean, it might not retain the formal tense. Or if you are, and this is an example I posted in an earlier video where someone needed the word horloge, or I think it was from French, horloge, which means wristwatch, translated into Chinese, and it got translated as seeing something. And why is this the case? Well, because it went through English. Wristwatch became basically watch, and then watch became to watch to see, and so wristwatch became translated as to see, which obviously it had nothing to do with, but because it used English as an intermediary, this was an issue. There are plenty of other issues that pop up, most often with things like metaphors, similes, innuendo, humor, because these are almost impossible to translate very often. And just with complicated sentences. You know, you have these complicated legalese sentences in a Romance language, which uses double negatives, and you're translating it into English, which doesn't have double negatives, and very often this can be an issue. I know I've seen it many times with certain expressions in Italian. Fatto salvo che. Fatto salvo che sometimes means as long as this happens, and sometimes it means as long as this doesn't happen. generalizing there, but it's true. It can mean the opposite depending on the situation, and Google Translate doesn't know this. And so things like this can happen very often, and these are the pitfalls you can fall into with Google Translation. So that's why if you're translating something important, you need to be careful. Now, I've mentioned all this, but I haven't mentioned the main issue with Google Translate and the main reason why people should not be using it. Well, if you're a law firm, if you're a financial company, if you are a governmental agency, if you have medical records or anything along those lines, anything that you don't want in the public domain, then you should not be using Google Translate. Why is this? Well, you may have heard this, but the way Google Translate works is it doesn't actually translate anything, but it learns. If it finds a certain expression to be translated from French into English, it'll scour the internet. Maybe it'll find 5,000 other examples of this translation and see that 4,900 times it was translated this way. And so it says, okay, it should be translated in this way. And that's great. That's an awesome way to learn, because also anytime you enter a translation and you correct the translation or use that translation, it learns from that as well. But what does this mean? This means that anytime you enter text into Google Translate, suddenly it's accessible. Not only is it accessible by anyone, but people can see when it was uploaded, by which IP address and from where, etc., etc. So this means that if you have any text you do not want in the public domain, that you do not want out there, do not put it into the Google Translate text. By the way, you do not need to be logged into Google for this to happen. This always happens. And so this is something you really should be careful about when you're using machine translation. So let's move on to the next example. And the next example is to hire a translator. Translators are great. And since I'm here and you might not know where to hire a translator, I can say the best websites to hire them, in my opinion, are pros.com, P-R-O-Z.com, and translatorscafe.com. You can find them in other normal freelancer websites like freelancer.com and Upwork, etc. But most translators will go to these specific websites, because they're catered to translators. And so if you want to find a good translator, that's a great place to go. Now, when you hire a translator, you need to keep in mind certain things. Translators, first of all, will translate from one language into the other very well, as long as they're a good translator. You need to identify the good translators, and that can be difficult when you don't speak the language. This is difficult even for translation agencies, and there's a whole, I won't get into it, but it can be very difficult to identify good translators. But also, you need to keep in mind that translators will translate well, but they won't do other things, like desktop publishing or inserting into HTML, or maybe just, they might help you out a little bit, but they translate from one language to the other, and that's what they want to do. And you start asking for ancillary things, for other things, and maybe to steer you in the right direction, they might not want to get that involved. All too often, I've seen people try to hire translators directly, and they'll come up with stuff like, say, join our dynamic team, be part of our great group, you can partake in all of our coolness of being part of our company. They don't necessarily want that. They want to get the job done, and that's it. There's a reason why they're freelancers. And also, you need to keep in mind that you need to know who to hire to translate something. I've seen people say they need a translation from French into English and they only want native French speakers. Well, usually you want people who are native in the target language, not the source language. You also need to make sure you're hiring the right type of translator. Now, running my agency, I had an end client contact me and say they needed a huge translation translated into traditional Chinese. And so I got the right translators and I got everyone in place. And it was only later on that they mentioned that the translation was actually for a client in Shanghai. And so I said, well, in that case, you don't need it into traditional Chinese. You probably need it into simplified Chinese. So they had to scramble and check, and come to find out they did need it in simplified Chinese. And had I not mentioned this, they would have wasted a lot of money translating it into the wrong language. When you hire a translator, they're going to hire it. If they had hired a translator directly, they would have found someone in traditional Chinese. That person would have translated the whole thing, got him paid, and then they would have found out that they needed it actually in simplified Chinese and not traditional Chinese. And so this is something you need to keep in mind. You really need to make sure you know what you're doing, who you're hiring, that you're going about it the right way. Also, when you pay the translators, how does it work? Do you pay them per hour, per word, per document, per page, per cup of coffee? How does it work? Just so you know, usually translators calculate whatever job they have to do per word. And so whatever other number they give you, it's going to be based on their per word calculation. Obviously, there's a lot of variation here. It can also depend on what type of document you're sending them. If it's a Microsoft Word document, it's very easy to work from. But if it's a scanned PDF, which with maybe some handwriting, it's very difficult as well. It also depends on the output they need. It depends on the timeline and how quickly you need the job done. It depends on how technical the text is. It depends on many different factors. And these are all things you need to keep in mind when you hire a translator. So that's why I'm saying when you hire a translator, it's great, but there are many other things you have to keep in mind. And that's why a good translation agency is actually worth it. Now, a translation agency can also help you because maybe you need things translated into 5 or 6 different languages. So you need to go through this whole thing for each language to hire a translator for each language. Also, do you hire one translator for each language, or do you hire a translator and another editor to look over the translation? How do you go about it? Well, yes, usually you should hire a translator and an editor to go over the translation, but you need to make sure that they can work together without actually meeting. And this can be an issue in and of itself. And so that's why a lot of people just decide to go with a translation agency. So let's get into the translation agency. How do you hire these? Well, quite frankly, you can just do a Google search for translation agency. Very often you'll come across the term LSP, language service provider. That's just what the cool kids are calling translation agencies these days. It means the same thing. Now, in order to find a translation agency, there are many different ways. Like I said, you can Google it. You can also go, once again, to those websites, pros.com, translatorscafe.com. But these websites are geared toward freelance translators and the agencies. And so they'll identify these agencies and maybe rate them for the translators. And it might be a bit difficult to navigate if you are searching for a translation agency to hire yourself. My recommendation, quite frankly, will be to go to LinkedIn. LinkedIn now has been very active. Translators have been very active on LinkedIn lately, especially since COVID came about. And so this means that the agencies working with them and hiring them have been very active as well. So LinkedIn should give you a good idea. If you just do a search on LinkedIn for translation agency or translations in certain language combinations or something like that and see which translation agencies pop up, that should give you a good idea. Otherwise, if you want something in your metro area, you can always search for something in your metro area. You can look for the Better Business Bureau and see what pops up, or your local Chamber of Commerce, etc., etc. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that I also have a translation agency, LuganoTranslations.com. So if you do need a translation done, you can absolutely feel free to go to LuganoTranslations.com and fill out the form for a free quote, or just shoot me a message and to ask me a question. And that's the other thing translation agencies can do. They can steer you in the right direction. Even if they cannot help you directly, usually they can send you in the right direction to have it done correctly. Like, for example, something I get contacted for very often is for interpreting jobs rather than translation jobs. Translation is written and interpreting is spoken, and we do written translations. We don't do interpreting. But obviously, I get contacted about it a lot, so I usually know how to steer the prospective client in the right direction so that they know who to contact and how to go about it. Sometimes I can't handle the translation myself. Our agency, for one reason or another, can't do it. Like, we don't do medical translations. But even in those cases, I can usually steer them in the right direction. Sometimes they don't even need a translation, but they need something ancillary to that, something along the lines of that. Maybe they need market research done in a specific market or country before they need a translation done. There too, I can usually help them out and steer them in the right direction. And that's what an agency can do. It can act as an intermediary between what you need and to finding you the right people, especially translators. Good translation agencies, they can do this very seamlessly, and that's why they're very useful. And that's why it's useful to have them, even if you think, oh, I don't want someone in the middle. These people in the middle can really help if they're worth it. And that's basically it. So these are the 3 main options. Once again, machine translation, hiring your translator directly, or hiring a translation agency. Hopefully this helps you in your choice and in finding a good translator or someone to perform your translation. And if you have any questions, once again, you can always shoot me a message. You can try commenting here. I try to check every now and then, but honestly, if you shoot me a message at LuganoTranslations.com, info@LuganoTranslations.com, or just go to that website and fill out the form, then I can respond in a much more timely fashion. That's pretty much it. Otherwise, I will talk to you next time. Okay, thanks. Bye. Savedum.